This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
My name is Emma Fay and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Guildhouse. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here today. First of all, I would like to invite Uncle Lewis O'Brien to give the Ghana welcome. Thank you, Uncle Lewis.
Marawichanga, Ghana Mina, Wangani, Mani Bundi Ghani Yatana, Naibiriko, Mankalakala, Tandanya, Mianaku, Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yakanandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. I talked to my neighbour this morning, then as I left I said, I'll see you later, and he said, I hope so.
Thank you, Uncle Lewis. I would like to welcome you all here this morning on behalf of ACE Open, the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, Guildhouse and the Tarnandy Festival for this very special presentation of the Perspectives Talk series. Perspectives is a new initiative developed by the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, ACE Open and Guildhouse this year. And this series of thought-provoking lectures invites leading artists, makers and cultural thought leaders to Adelaide to engage with compelling ideas currently shaping our world. We're actually really fortunate to have Nikki Compston, the Artistic Director of the Tarnandy Festival, here with us this morning, which is phenomenal given what a huge program is being presented in Adelaide right at this very moment. And I'd like to welcome Nikki to come up here and welcome us all as part of the Tarnandy Festival and a huge opening weekend festivities. So please join me in welcoming Nikki.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me here, and thank you Uncle Lewis for your welcome. You always make me giggle. And I'd just like to also acknowledge that we are here today on the lands of the Ghana people, and I'd like to pay my respect to Uncle Lewis and to the elders past and all of the work that Uncle Lewis does towards enabling the younger generation to become the elders of tomorrow. I'm a Barkindji person, I'm an artist, I'm a curator and I'm an educator, and I'm very proud to be the Artistic Director of Tarnandy, Festival of Contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art, and I'm very grateful that Ema Tavola is able to be with us today, and I have to duck out but I'll be able to see the recording and hear what you've got to say. So thank you for coming all this way, Emma. It's lovely to have you with us and lovely to meet you. Tarnandy has grown since the inaugural festival in 2015, and we were very, very fortunate in 2017 to be given further funding because initially it was a festival, a one-off. And I think that BHP were really pleased with what we did in that first year. We partnered with 20 organisations across the City of Adelaide to present exhibitions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art. And this year we have 30 partners and 35 exhibitions and performances in addition to what we have at the Art Gallery of South Australia. So it's wonderful to actually have the support to be able to think long term and to be able to work with artists whose ideas might not be able to be realised in a 12-month period of time. So some of the artists that we're exhibiting this year, the talk and the conversation that was happening around their ideas started back 4 years ago. And that support is what people need in order to really think about their ideas and to work through how they can realise that in a gallery space. So we're very grateful for the support that we have and very grateful to the small team of people at the Art Gallery of South Australia who support Tarnandy and enable it to happen. because it's just, I can't quite believe it, to be honest. The opening on Thursday night was something that I've just, in my wildest dreams, couldn't even ever have imagined. And just to see so many people coming through the gallery and wanting to hear from the artists, wanting to be part of understanding more about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, it's just phenomenal, and it's something that is very close to my heart. I think that as Australians and as international people, we all want to be respectful. I'm sure there is compassion in each and every person, but it's about how do we learn? How do we find out about that which we don't feel that we belong to? And I really do believe that through the arts, we can engage really, thought. We can enable people to think, to speak, and to have an opportunity to actually have their voice heard. This weekend, we have a series of talks at the Art Gallery, starting this morning at 11 o'clock, and then followed by a talk at 12. And then there's a talk in the afternoon at 2 p.m. with Uncle Badger Bates, who's one of my Barkindji elders. This morning at 11 is the Buku-Lange Malka artists, and then the younger people from the community are talking about the studio space at 12. And then at 2:30, the Tangentyere artists are speaking to their work in conversation with Thea Anamara Perkins, who has painted their portraits that are sitting alongside of their paintings. We also have openings right across the city. You can look at the program online to see what's happening. Tonight at 5 o'clock at Ace Open is the opening of the Sejuna Arts organisation with No Black Seas, and that's a mentorship project that's happened with artists Ioane Scarce and Dr. Ryan Presley. So I urge you to come along, participate in whatever you can, and I hope you get a lot out of being part of Tarnandi. Thank you for having me.
You're absolutely right, Nikki. There's just so much warmth and generosity of sharing, and I think that it's really what we're also hoping to achieve through this series is to through visual culture and thinking about visual culture as a mechanism for really engaging with deeper ideas, and Tarnandi Festival does just that. So today we present our final talk in the series for 2019. Ema Tavola will reflect on aspects of her creative practice, including curating as a mechanism for social inclusion, its potential to shift representational politics, and exhibition making as a mode of decolonisation. Our talk today is being Auslan interpreted, and I'd like to thank Sign Language Australia for this service. The session is also being recorded, and a video will be available to watch on the Hawke Centre website next week, so please do share that news and video link with friends and colleagues who may not have been able to make it today. As we are recording, please do switch off your phones or make them silent to avoid interruptions, but feel free to join and share your thoughts using our social media links shown behind me. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce Ema Tavola. Ema is an independent artist curator based in South Auckland, New Zealand. Having established her practice whilst managing Fresh Gallery Otara, a local government-funded community art gallery, Ema's curatorial concerns are grounded in opportunities of contemporary art to engage grassroots audiences, shift representational politics, and archive the Pacific diaspora experience. Ema has worked in galleries and museums throughout New Zealand and regularly contributes to the international dialogue through curatorial projects, critical writing, and speaking engagements just like this one. Please join me in welcoming Ema to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a privilege to be here. I arrived on Thursday and got to see the opening at the gallery, and it blew my mind. Really amazing. I have a disclaimer this morning. I may cry. It's often associated with weakness or inexperience or fragility, but it is none of those things. It is simply a pure alignment of heart and mind. Sorry if it makes anyone uncomfortable. Don't worry about me. I'm as strong as they come. My second disclaimer is there is a bit of nudity in my presentation, and that's all you have to worry about. So ni sambula vanaka, to the ancient land we're standing on, to the traditional and ongoing rightful landowners, I acknowledge what was here before the assault of colonisation. Who was here? What was here will always be. On behalf of the communities I represent, we acknowledge and honour tangata whenua, people of the land, always. Thank you all for being here. To the organisers of the Perspectives programme, Vivian, Emma, I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to offer an insight into my practice and position as a Fijian New Zealander, trying to change the art world one project at a time. I will turn this on. Will I? Yes. Yes, okay. Within my practice, I resist academic framing because there is a power that goes with what is validated in the academy's eyes that excludes the parts of my world, my communities that feel the realist. The academy and its institutions are inextricably connected to imperialist structures that create environments that we as people of colour in the colonised South Pacific have to survive in but are not built for us to thrive in. I speak in art historical, museum, and art world contexts from a basis of practice-based research, understanding our time and space by being in it, moving through it, being challenged by it, being shaped by it, and taking it with me with everything I do. I work almost exclusively with contemporary Pacific artists because the Pacific Ocean is my comfort zone, my pleasure zone, my grounding. The Pacific Ocean connects us as Pacific Islanders. It is our sameness and our difference. The Pacific Ocean has birthed a form of scholarship that is deeply rooted in Indigenous epistemological framing. It is the likes of the late Epeli Hauofa, the late Teresa Vernon, the late Grace Mira Melissa, who have inspired my thinking, set my heart on fire, and stabilized my journey into uncharted waters. I arrived at curating through a sculptural practice and through service as a public servant and as a Pacific Islander living and working in a community that faced and continues to face systemic inequalities, high levels of deprivation, and fairly pronounced social exclusion from mainstream institutions, including galleries. I arrived at curating to serve my people. I've lived as a Pacific Islander in diaspora almost all my life, but through my family and community, upholding and passing on cultural identity and tattooing my skin, I've maintained my connection to the Pacific Ocean as a means of survival and self-preservation. By being embedded in Pacific spaces where Pacific Islanders feel comfortable, open, relevant, I draw strength and inspiration. New Zealand's population is predominantly Pākehā, colonial settler communities with largely British ancestry. The second largest group is Māori, tangata whenua, Indigenous peoples. The third is Asian communities, and the fourth, with less than 8% of the country's population, is Pacific Islanders. We are in a cultural climate in New Zealand where the thirst for diversity is palpable. Our National Arts Investment Agency introduced a diversity policy in 2015, and long-term investment clients accounting for the country's largest public arts institutions have since had delivering to diversity as a key performance indicator in their contractual obligations. The area of South Auckland is home to New Zealand's largest concentration of Pacific Islanders. Creative production, commerce, discourse, and participation exist at high levels in our Pacific communities, but it has little to do with galleries or hierarchies of the art world or art school. Our Indigenous creative practices and their value systems are inextricably connected to our cultures, rituals, ancestries, and islands. Galleries can be hostile places. They can alienate people when the frames of reference for reading, engaging, and valuing visual language can be over-intellectualized and thus disconnected from the capacity for us as the audience to understand the space we hold between the work and our hearts and minds. I've been invested for 15 years in understanding the mode of creating Pacific exhibitions and events in Pacific space accessible to Pacific Islander audiences, because that space where we see our worlds reflected in all its nuanced forms, where we have agency to speak to the work and allow it to speak to us, is where we can affect change for our communities. It is a conscious decision to avoid the filtering of our Pacific experience through persistently colonial infrastructure that is deeply embedded in the arts in New Zealand and in the colonised South Pacific. Curating has become a form of tackling the wounds of colonisation, to re-empower Pacific Islanders by affirming their presence and mana and engaging our communities as critically relevant audiences for gallery-based contemporary art and the worlds we inhabit as arts professionals, with one foot in the grassroots and the other sometimes reluctantly in the art world. Decolonisation has become a word that has seemingly lost meaning in the art world. At a conference I was at last weekend, it was casually implied that the decolonisation has become a tired trope. When decolonisation is an embodied labour, when you decolonise in the work that you do and the world you create for your children, you don't stop because it has fallen out of trend. I see the work that I, along with many of my peers, am involved in as decolonisation in practice, not as theory, not as a concept or curatorial construct. It is practical and requires radical shifts in thinking, in framing, and redistributing power and privilege. Since 2012, I've been freelancing as an independent curator, and have found that my approach to exhibition making has largely come to be framed within wider gallery and institutional contexts as a way to access Pacific people and ideas. This is, at best, an awesome way to meet new Pacific communities and deliver programming that enables wider arts audiences to experience what Pacific art and its discourses can be when led and informed by Pacific people. But at worst, it can be a thinly veiled box-ticking exercise, a cheat sheet to modelling social inclusion without the baggage of organisational change. This space of being a mediator between Pacific audiences, artists, and institutions can be tiring, socially and politically taxing, and emotionally exhausting. Managing expectations, participating in conversations that are often filled with culturally offensive racial biases is a workplace hazard experienced by so many people of colour working within and with colonial institutions. The position I sit in today is informed by curating projects that have taken me to different extremes of cultural safety, of comfort, and criticality. Two of the projects I'd like to share have been informed and constructed through engaging communities in Fiji for mainstream institutional shows in New Zealand, and the third is my most recent exhibition, which was delivered last month at Vunilangivau, a gallery and community space I've been able to establish in Otahuhu, South Auckland. These three projects demonstrate the ways social practice and collectivism as a principle have sat in three different institutional settings. I want to share the experience of these three exhibitions from a curatorial perspective, to speak frankly about them, about the logistics, the interface with the host institutions, the audiences they did and didn't attract, and the ways institutions can do better in understanding and catering to diverse communities. In 2015, I co-curated a creative research project and culminating exhibition with Dr. Teresa Vernon dedicated to Fijian women's tattoo, or Vea Gear. Fijian female tattooing was eradicated through the adoption of Christianity and has been rendered invisible through the process of generational colonization. When missionaries told our women to cover their skin, our bodies became invisible, neglectfully excluded from the written histories of our existence. Gradually, women stopped marking their bodies. The generational impact of this erasure is that the cultural memory of our tattoo practice has almost entirely disappeared. The Vea Gear Project spanned 9 months of collective research and dialogue between 7 Fijian women based in Australia and New Zealand. The group travelled to Suva, Fiji in September 2015 to deliver talks and open up discussion with Fijian communities about the information that had been found. Notably, Fiji is the only country in the Pacific that holds the largest collection of its own cultural objects in its national museum. For every other country in the region, the largest collections of their items of cultural value sit in museum vaults and vitrines, accruing value for their institutional hosts in faraway places. At Fiji Museum, we hosted an open day sharing lo-fi printouts of archival material, drawings, and motifs discovered in museum publications, and invited the audience to draw their own tattoos on appropriately Fijian forms. These dialogue events grounded the project. The knowledge of Vea Gear didn't belong to us. The process of facilitating discussion about our collective cultural loss was incredibly moving. Women and men woke up memories and stories of bumbu, grandmothers who were marked. Facilitating this dialogue emboldened Fijians to remember that we are descendants from strong, brave women who uphold beauty standards which are entirely our own. The visit breathed life into the idea of an indigenous womanist practice which was unique to Fiji, but through the invitational participation of Papua New Guinean Australian tattooist Julia Mangeau-Gray, linked the knowledge of Vea Gear to a wider Melanesian practice of female tattooing. On the Fiji Museum veranda during the Vea Gear Project Open Day, Julia tattooed. It was the act that brought it all together, the moment when the information or research transitioned from the mind to body, from paper to skin. The act of marking the skin, breaking it, letting it bleed, leaving an indelible mark. The act as the pinnacle of commitment and revival. Julia started to mark Fijian women that week, informed by the motifs and clues we were finding, and the revival of Vea Gear was set in motion. After the research, the talks, and the museum visits, the artists developed work in response to the findings and the process. The exhibition was produced for St. Paul Street Gallery in central Auckland in March 2016 and opened as part of the Pacific Arts Association International Symposium and also featured in the Auckland Arts Festival. Two things happened with the Vea Gear project that I didn't anticipate. The tattoo world has defined a language of symbolic meaning that enables anyone to select visual vocabulary from anywhere in the world and own it, embody it, essentially redefining its meaning with each time it's applied to new skin. In terms of ceremonial meaning attached to tattoo from the Pacific, the visual vocabulary of our marks has essentially become part of a free and open and entirely unregulated market. Seeing the way Maori and Polynesian tattoo has been popularized on a global scale, the women in the Vea Gear project had an understandable reluctance to share findings of their research in relation to the motifs and actual mark making of the practice. There was a strong sense that the marks needed to be protected. The result, from my curatorial perspective, was an exhibition that spoke less to the richness of the process and the immense and emotional discovery that the artists had enabled themselves and the communities who participated in the project in Fiji, and more about a kind of protectionism that guarded the information, held it close. The work in the exhibition came from a heartfelt place, but it felt like it was trying to be something for audiences who were not our own. To me, it felt cold, disconnected. It didn't help that it was held in an institutional gallery, which at the time had little to no measures for engaging Pacific audiences or communities within or outside of the university. We delivered 2 public program events that brought in a varied audience to the space, but the context of the gallery and the nature of the work produced still sat uneasily with me. It was the first time I felt an exhibition outcome was not enough, and that the process of engaging with Fijians in Fiji was where the mana of the project sat. I severed my ties with the Vea Gear project, who've gone on to produce exhibitions in Australia, Fiji, and New Zealand, but that uneasiness about what is lost and rendered invisible in the gallery within the framework of Western fine art felt unresolved. I've continued to work with Julia Mangeau-Gray in the area of revival through practice, marks as mana, Indigenous women over abstractions of what is important to Indigenous women, and the third project I'm going to discuss today felt like a healing conclusion to this problematic dynamic. After the Vea Gear Project, I wanted to understand how the cultural currency of socially embedded Pacific art practice could exist in institutional space. In 2016, I was commissioned by the New Zealand Maritime Museum to produce an exhibition that linked New Zealand to the Pacific. Whilst there were some reservations about the ways Pacific people and narratives are represented and positioned in dominant culture museum contexts, one thing that settled my discomfort was the ocean. The museum's central philosophy and literal location, built on a quay over the Auckland harbour, was this powerful connection that seemed to render any social barriers cultural institutions can present to non-traditional audiences almost invisible. The ocean is our territory as Pacific Islanders. As Epeli Hauofa so beautifully reminds us, Oceania is vast, Oceania is expanding, Oceania is hospitable and generous, Oceania is humanity rising from the depths of brine and regions of fire. Deeper still, Oceania is us. We are the sea, we are the ocean. I'd been blogging with my father, Kaliopate Tavola, about our village on the island of Javuni in the Kandavu province of southern Fiji since 2010. I proposed to co-curate an exhibition with him about the ways the internet had connected me and his readers to our village and the island as a form of digital cultural transmission. The project, entitled Javuni Siviayani Navuni Langi Beyond the Horizon, evolved into the opposite of my experience with the Vea Gear Project, more knowns than unknowns, grounded and not diasporically disjointed, working within the parameters of Fijian custom and centralizing indigenous knowledge over imported settler colonial perspectives. It was the project that took me home and reminded me of my place within the Fijian matrix of my family, extended family, my clan and village, and in relation to other Fijians. We proposed to use the most visited content on the blog, Javuni's origin story, as an anchor for the exhibition. With a grant from Creative New Zealand, we plan to travel to Javuni, 60 nautical miles south of Suva, to undertake a storytelling session and engage Javuni's children to illustrate their interpretation of the story. The drawings would then become the visual structure of the exhibition, blown up to mural size, representing a literal process of intergenerational cultural transmission. The process of working with the Maritime Museum was challenging. The curator would ask me questions like, why should anyone care about Javuni? The questioning was well-meaning, I can assume, but the act of defining one's relevance within dominant culture environments tends to wear down one's agency to be able to hold space in those settings. I started to rethink how much we would be giving to the museum and their precious paying audience. How much would we have to cater our narrative to the perceived limited abilities of the museum's audience to care? Going to the village is not a light undertaking. We would need to factor in time for ceremonial obligations, and in taking my daughter for the first time, we needed to do a kaunimata ceremony, the presentation of the firstborn. Our project in Javuni was wrapped in Fijian custom. Upon arrival, the mboka is an opportunity for those who have been away to offer apologies for their absence, to request forgiveness for not knowing what has gone on since they've been away, and to contribute a sevu, a customary offering to honour the moment. Next was the kaunimata, a presentation of my daughter, Lanuola Maria Aniseko, to our matangali, our clan or landowning unit, and the exchange of material wealth that signals Lanuola's ability to return as part of our matangali for the rest of her life. We spent 2 days with the children from Javuni, sharing drawing techniques, encouraging them to present and discuss their work, talking about their favourite things. We turned the village hall into a gallery and went some way towards breaking through the Fijian cultural practice that is reinforced by our education system of repetition-based learning. The process encouraged the children to find strength in their own voices, their own ideas, and that within creativity, there is no real right or wrong. My father did an exceptional job of facilitating these workshops. He is the head of our Matangali, and watching a Fijian man who holds such a significant traditional leadership role, speaking about the freedom of voice and expression, being so utterly chill and accessible to our children was a beautiful and poignant thing to observe. We staged the storytelling session as the last part of what had become a Javani children's holiday program. They listened intently to the story of the two Vu, or superhuman ancestors, who battled for supremacy over the land and waters of the Kandavu region. After listening to the narrative, the children spent time illustrating their interpretation of the story. They were given as much paper as they liked and used only black marker pens. They drew with fluid confidence the shape of island silhouettes, different trees, fish and flowers. It's obvious that their natural environment shapes their perception. Coming from the diaspora, it was heartening to remember how belonging is not only a cultural construct, but one grounded in a relationship with land, sea and sky. Another element of the project was a commissioned woven mat produced by the Songo Songo Wakamarama, the Village Women's Association. The dimensions of the mat were exactly the size of the Maritime Museum exhibition space, and the creative brief was left open to be guided by the weavers. The mat was created to be gifted to the museum as a sevu sevu, an offering of gratitude for enabling the project. An important feature of the exhibition was the wall of acknowledgements. We credited every child who participated in the workshops, every weaver, and every person in our Matangali and wider village who contributed to the success of the project. At the last minute, a graphic designer from my extended family asked if he could make a logo or masthead for the project. The exhibition had been promoted for months with a graphic layout that the museum had created using a promotional image I'd submitted at the beginning of the project. I couldn't say no to this last-minute contribution, and I definitely couldn't critique his offering. What he submitted was as fresh as it gets. A look and feel that felt so quintessentially Fiji, not in its global associations with the cowboy font and iconography, but somehow in ways I couldn't quite articulate. It was perfect. A small battle ensued with the curator of the museum, as breaking the promotional language of the exhibition was so thoroughly unorthodox. We debated why it simply had to be included, and my role as co-curator within the dynamics of this project meant I simply couldn't say no. The battle was won, and the graphic design by Sao Sarasau was installed at the main entrance of the Edmiston Gallery. The finished install included the mat, the illustrations, a map of the location of Javani in relation to Auckland, and a series of photographs documenting the project. The two videos were shown in the space, one of the storytelling session followed by an extended sunset capturing Javani's unique vunilangi or horizon line, and the second a very cheesy overview video of me narrating the rationale for the exhibition, something the museum's curator suggested, I wince at even to this day. That is our masthead. Visitors were asked to remove their shoes while walking on the mat, which helped frame the way people engaged with the exhibition. An activity table at the far end of the space was an invitation for visitors, and children especially, to contribute their ideas of belonging to the space. There have been two beautiful outcomes of this exhibition. One is that my father and I received a publishing offer from the University of the South Pacific's Institute of Education to turn our origin story and the children's illustrations into a bilingual children's book. The Fijian language version is in Javani dialect, no longer spoken in its purest form, and exists as the first book in our dialect ever published. The second outcome was a serendipitous full circle. I moved home to Fiji in September last year, the month our book was published. A gap in programming at the University of the South Pacific's Oceania Centre Gallery came up in October, just as my father and I were looking for a venue to host our book launch. We were able to restage the Javani exhibition at Oceania Centre Gallery to celebrate the launch of our books and the outcome of the initial exhibition. Unlike the first exhibition, we staged This one in 11 days. The install was simple and focused on the photographic narrative of the project's process. It included QR codes to the online content, which had added so much to the first exhibition. Handwritten captions on the photographic prints added much-needed voice to the story of our project. The exhibition design was slightly unintentionally a village aesthetic, a kind of makeshift hanging system that swayed gently in the breeze. The children's illustrations were hand-painted on foam board and positioned on the walls of the gallery with photographs hanging within the space. Amazingly, with only 11 days' notice, the book launch and exhibition opening was well attended. Our Suva-based Matangali came out to support in a big way and felt super proud to be part of an exhibition that took Javuni across the seas to Auckland before returning at home. In both the Vea Gear Project and Javuni Siviayani the Vunilangi, and Beyond the Horizon, the process of producing the culminating exhibitions outweighed the final outcome in relation to the value and impact of the work on Fijians and in relation to Fiji. The impact of both projects sat in the doing, the discourse and engagement between Fijians. The revival of Fijian women's tattoo, which the Vea Gear Project played an important role in, and the reminder of the value of oral histories, cultural transmission, and the Javuni dialect for Javuni people and descendants didn't happen because people came to an exhibition. Sorry. From a curatorial perspective, in both cases, the exhibitions to some extent failed to convey the depth and mana of the process. In both exhibitions, interpretive text could have been employed to provide audiences with detailed contexts to every image, every artwork, every reference to the wider work the projects represented. But in both projects, the dynamics of the galleries, their audiences and wider organizational settings shifted the protocols of sharing. Ooh. My practice doesn't exist for Fijians exclusively, and whilst Pacific art is the centre of my universe, the gallery is still very much my sanctuary. There are ways to indigenize the white cube and embody safe social inclusion. The third exhibition I want to discuss today, Line Blow You Me, Our People, Our Lines, was delivered last month at Vunilangi, the independent gallery I opened in South Auckland earlier this year. Vunilangi is based on the principle of positioning Pacific art consciously within Pacific space. It is located in Otahuhu, a suburb in South Auckland, with a diverse ethnic population, but renowned for its plastic, fantastic, budget-friendly shopping district, which caters heavily to the Pacific diaspora community. The gallery is located in the heart of the commercial area of Otahuhu, in an arcade where every shop is owned and operated by Pacific Islanders. Line Blow You Me, Our People, Our Lines, was dedicated to the work of Papua New Guinean Australian tattoo practitioner Julia Mangiao-Gray, a former Adelaide resident. The exhibition was in part a testing ground for a show we're producing in London next year, but also an opportunity to shine the light on the remarkable and largely under-the-radar contribution Julia has made to female tattoo revival in such a short space of time. I'm interested in tattooing because the body becomes a story. I prescribe to the idea that placing a tattoo between you and me is an intervention, a way to control the way my body is perceived, to distort the perceptions and misconceptions that affect the ways we move through the world. Dreadful. Sorry. This is what you get for being a smoker. Terrible. That was my mother's voice in my head. Funny. For me, tattooing has become a deeply political act of authoring my own experience, defining and asserting my connections to Fiji and the Pacific Ocean. Julia has been marking me since 2015. She arrived at her mark-making practice via dance and photography and the decision to make a documentary film in 2012. Her film, Pep Talk, Reading Between Our Lines, is based on the journey of 4 Papua New Guinean Australian women as they trace the relationships of Melanesian tattoo from their respective regions to practices across the Pacific. They document conversations between in Papua New Guinea that reveal where tattooing practice stopped between their grandmothers' and mothers' generations. The film exposes stories of trauma, of erasure. It is a filmic archive of Pacific women's bodies, filmed by Pacific women. Throughout the film, the women embody the research, being marked by all along the way, discussing meaning and mana with Pacific people across Oceania, Australia, and New Zealand. For Julia, the film was a catalyst for Melanesian mark-making to be revived and survive. The movement required more than awareness, it needed action. Oh, thank you. That's lovely. I might just wait. In 2014, Julia shifted her focus from choreography and filmmaking to learning the tattoo art form. She took the revival of skin marking from research to practice. She trained with hand tool practitioners in New Zealand and travelled back and forth between Papua New Guinea, Australia and New Zealand before choosing to settle in Auckland and start tattooing full-time. The title of the exhibition, Line Blow You Me, in Papua New Guinean Pidgin, roughly translates as Our People, Our Lines. Line represents not only a physical line, a dominant element of Julia's visual vocabulary, but line as in genealogy, a familial or ancestral trajectory. The exhibition was an effort to demonstrate the contemporary settings of this practice in diaspora, and as a mobile art form connected through social media with its roots firmly in Meki or Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and in Melanesia as a whole. As an exhibition in a small independent gallery, Line Blow You Me was an opportunity to author a Melanesian female perspective on the practice, centralizing voices and experiences of Melanesian women. The difference between positioning this type of narrative in a mainstream institution is that curatorial framing didn't have to lean towards educational elements of defining the practice in the context of geography, history, relationality to dominant culture in New Zealand. It was simply women telling their stories on their own terms, in their own ways, full stop. The intention of the exhibition was to demonstrate the socially embedded nature of Julia's practice and Melanesian contemporary female tattoo as a reflection of the wider collectivism which underpins sociological frameworks across the Pacific. The exhibition was lo-fi, a village aesthetic, an approach which could be packed down and installed at a venue in the Pacific, such as a village hall. It was site-specific, purposefully produced in materials that could be touched by hands and tears, by children. It was made to be connected with physically. It centralizes the voice of Melanesian women through texts and visual narratives of their experience with 2 main components: the revival wall, a hard copy Instagram record of Julia's work, movements and inspiration from the last 6 months, and the stories of Michaelin Pokerop, Papua New Guinea, and Emmeline Matangi, Fiji. Michaelin Pokerop and Emmeline Matangi are 2 Auckland-based Melanesian women invited to share insights into their experience of being marked and wearing the marks from their own perspectives in whatever way they felt like telling the story. This part of the exhibition drew on the mode of early ethnographic journals to draw reference to the problematic way knowledge has been created, particularly about tattoo, based on white male colonist experience in the context of Fiji, where little recorded history exists about Fijian tattoo. Baron von Hugel's The Fiji Journals, 1875 to 1877, are one such source, which provides insights into the ways tattoo and Fijian women were encountered and languaged. Michaelin and Emmeline were given full creative license to frame their own stories and contexts first-hand, first person, languaging and illustrating their own experiences. Neither are visual artists, and each developed stories independently. Emmeline has spent most of her professional career as a primary school educator, and her visual narrative had a strong school poster board aesthetic. She even noted her learning outcomes and challenges and offered audiences an insight into the contexts of where being tattoo sat and sits within her life as a teacher, a rugby player, a wife, and a mother. Emmeline's daughter, Rae Dawn, aged 9, was with her during some of her sessions. Emmeline notes the conversations she had with her daughter and invited her to make contributions to her narrative. She drew pictures of what her marks might look like one day and expressed her view that hers would be different from her mum's. Emmeline noted the meaning of Vea Gear is her daughter. It is the transmission of value and knowledge between generations that these marks represent. It is affirming the pride of our bodies, reconnecting with an ancestral feminine power that we know changes the way our daughters look at us and how they look at themselves. Michaelin is a full-time social worker. Her story consisted of 3 diary entries written about the day before she was first marked by Julia, the day of the marking, and 1 year later. Her written accounts are factual, as if evidence-based. They express emotion cautiously. Hanging amongst her text and photographs is a family fibre skirt from Mekio, Central Province, Papua New Guinea. As Julia has always asserted, Melanesian marks are inextricably connected to dance and ritual in traditional contexts. As a mark maker, it is her grounding in dance that enables her to read the body and mark it appropriately. Michaelin's marks are brought to life when she dances. Her family fibre skirt is the sound, the feeling, the smell, and the movement associated with her connection to home. Michaelin's narratives had such a different starting point to Emmeline's. The cultural loss of tattoo in her family is only 1 generation deep, and a photograph of her bubu, her grandmother, was central to her story. What both Michaelin and Emmeline represent in their stories is the social embeddedness of the decision to be marked, the tattooing process, and the community around each woman that is affected by their marks. They define their communities in their stories, those who their marks connect them to, and who they are defined by as part of that collective. Whilst this journey has happened in diaspora, disjointed from their island contexts, the oral narratives of connection, of geography and movement are embedded in each line and each dot. The second element of the exhibition, the revival wall, consisted of the last 73 images from Julia's Instagram feed, documenting roughly 6 months of practice and inspiration. Embedded in the photography hung in the Instagram grid format was a monitor screening her documentary, Pep Talk, Reading Between Our Lines, the catalyst for her mark-making practice, in addition to short video works made as stop-motion performances. The wall represented a community of largely Pacific Islander women marked in New Zealand, Australia, Borneo, and London, connected by Julia, connected by their marks, and connected by the internet. Each image had a handwritten caption by Julia, giving the moment represented in the photograph voice and context. The wall as a whole aimed to demonstrate Julia's visual vocabulary and its frame of reference from Papua New Guinean tattoo. The majority of the images were taken after or during marking sessions, with women looking full, glowing in the moment. Many of us speak about those moments after being tattooed by Julia, where you feel like the marks have always been there, that they sit so naturally with the ways we hold our bodies. There's something in the eyes of these women. Julia says it's the moment they shift, energies shift. We move forward in our lives, marked, changing the people around us and the way they perceive us. Line Blow You Me, Our People, Our Lines, filled Vunilangivo's 25 square metre gallery space with 119 photographs, 7 films, 5 Papua New Guinean bilum bags, 6 framed prints, and 1 whispering grass skirt. The exhibition ran for the month of September at Vunilangivo and attracted broad audiences, but most significantly Indigenous women, mothers and daughters, Papua New Guineans and Fijians. We closed the exhibition 3 weeks ago, today. This is live. We closed it with a live tattooing session between Julia's daughter, Salivasa, and Julia's mother, Mali. Salivasa has been Julia's stretcher, her little grasshopper, since the age of 11. When she turned 16 this year, she was tattooed on the back of her thighs as a significant starting point of her tattoo journey. Mali, Julia's mother, is of the generation that tattooing skipped. Whilst they were not her first marks, she had never been tattooed by her granddaughter. The session was filmed for the exhibition in London in January as a performance of intergenerational cultural transmission, of revival and familial connections of Melanesian women marking Melanesian women. Upon completion, Julia's dance class, who had been learning about Papua New Guinean movement, adorned meki or grass skirts and face paint and danced Mali and Salivasa out of the Vunilangivo studio and into the arcade. Julia always makes me cry. When Julia is asked, "What do your tattoos mean?" she says, "Everything to me and nothing to you." She's blunt like that. In the words of Dr. Tarika Bolatangidi, her marks are her sacred geometry. For me, my Vea Gear have changed the way I hold my body and how my daughter sees our bodies. My loin markings have shifted generational taboos and broken curses. With my shifts, my community shifts. For every woman, whether in the village or in diaspora, the meaning of being marked is theirs. It is not their job to define their choices, their connections and rationales to anyone. I curated Line Blow You Me, Our People, Our Lines out of gratitude for Julia Mange Au Gray. When I meet other women who she has marked, I joke that we are all Julia's children. In hosting this exhibition, I had the privilege of talking tattoo and meaning with Indigenous women every day for a month in a room where our visibility, our voices, and moments of joy and pride were more pronounced, more concentrated than I have ever encountered in a gallery setting. Through all the combined energies that informed Line Blow You Me, the space that was created managed to negotiate the terrain of protection, ownership, amplification, and sharing like a kind of lo-fi offline social network of fierce brown women. So for me, the most revolutionary, most empowered space for Pacific art to shift and dance with our own communities is about creating space for counter-narratives, space for the discourse that exists within Pacific space and non-Pacific space. Effective social inclusion requires power to be shared, and for that to happen, those in power have to release their grip on the powers that institutions have put in their hands generationally since the Pacific region was first colonized. Agents of institutions must understand colonization not from a written account of the victor, but from those who have been generationally diminished and generationally survived the assault of our culture, on our cultures, on our languages, and on our bodies. Institutions must understand that sharing power means unlearning, relearning, and recentering knowledge, and as a result, a new mode of genuine engagement may look completely opposite to what has been done in the past. For the Pacific, within the current climate of global warming and the shifting geopolitics of our region, our connectedness, our agency and presence in the wider world is more vital than ever before. So from one little gallery in South Auckland to you here in Adelaide, Vinaka Vakalevu, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Emma. I confess I got quite emotional, as you did too. And I think my voice is going to go now. The reflection of your practice as a social service is incredibly humbling and incredibly generous, and I can see how that has really played out in those projects, and thank you so much for taking us through those beautiful, incredibly meaningful examples. I would like to throw it open to questions from the audience. We've got about 15 minutes, and I'm sure there's some questions out there. Would anyone like to start us off? We've got microphones, so please wait for a microphone to come to you. Would anyone like to kick off with a question? Up the front, thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. That was just so warm and intimate, and thank you, so much for sharing. I wanted to ask about the research, and that you call it a practice-based research, and how these 3 projects that you've presented to us, the process of filtering, I suppose, when you're so much a part of the creation of work within community, that thinking curatorially about how you filter it down to an exhibition display. You sort of talked about being this mediator between the institutions and the community and this process of unlearning. How do you grapple or sort of work with so much material? And I also wanted to ask about the London presentation. How do you retain that voice and that spirit when it goes to a non-Pacific region and is presented to a predominantly white audience? How are you going to maintain that kind of spirit within the work and the exhibition?
Yeah, no, that's a good lot of information. I think where I've arrived at this year has been the way to do things is to create the bricks and mortar of our own counter-narrative. So opening our own space has enabled us to define what safe space looks like, and to invite curators and arts workers from outside of our communities to come in and experience the work of our communities within that environment. So I think for a lot of people that I work with, that's a really great way to work. But there are also wonderful institutions who are understanding more in the sort of culture of this thirst for diversity, what engagement and genuine engagement requires, particularly in that there is no one size fits all. So understanding a community is really, particularly in the Pacific context, about taking time. And that taking time means breaking bread, where time is actually, linear time is not a concept. So you spend time building a relationship, like what Javuni showed me and that project, where every move we made in the village required an acknowledgement of that move. And so I think it's something I've learned so much, and just recognizing how every conversation, the language that we use, all affects the way we work together. And so, I think, Vunilangi Vo is like a dream gallery for me. I've talked about opening my own space for 17 years, and so that's a long time percolating. And working in other spaces and other museums and taking all of that to sort of form what this space could be. So that's probably where I've come to. I don't know how we do it. The community around the gallery, who I acknowledge a little bit up there, we're all kind of unpaid arts workers who are just doing this because this is our heart and soul work. So, the funding will come eventually. But now London is an interesting situation. We're working with a luxury design studio, which is a level of wealth that we are very unfamiliar with. They have a beautiful premises in Marylebone. They've got a ground floor gallery and showrooms. We've thought a lot about how to translate into that space, particularly given that central London is literally the cradle of the empire. The gallery that is like a stone's throw away from Marble Arch, and it's like, it has messed with our heads quite a lot. So for us, we wanted to strip it back and look at what revival is in practice, which is the mark making, the wearing of the marks, and what revival relies on, which is the transmission of knowledge through generations. So what we have devised for the exhibition is a simple 3-channel video installation, each channel focusing on each woman in that moment. So Mali, Julia, and Salivasa, and the sort of choreography that happens between the 3 women, where I think the viewer is seeing the women and the space between them rather than the marks. So, you know, every exhibition is a learning curve. We'll see if that works. The organisation is quite happy for us to play with ideas. They're giving us space for a photographic essay, as well as a booth for video works. So there's lots of context to what we're providing. And the furniture itself, so it's a suite of furniture, a chaise longue and 2 tables, has been in development for 2 years. And when Julia and I first met with them, I mean, she said straight away, we're not going to put our motifs on upholstery. And they have taken time, flown us over to understand what it means to reflect a cultural practice when commodity at the end can't just take that cultural practice, but rather respond to what it means. So in watching Julia work with Vasa, Salivasa, her daughter, they have actually named the whole collection the Salivasa collection, because they are so interested in what that space is between, you know, in terms of cultural, intergenerational transmission. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes. Thank you.
That's incredibly intriguing. I'm very curious to see how that plays out.
Yeah, me too.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I've really been encouraged and challenged by it. I was recently at a different talk by an Indigenous urban artist from Melbourne, and he talked about the fact that Indigenous art in Australia is not actually traditional Indigenous art, in that their art practices were always for education and teaching and training up the next generation, and the vast majority of it was temporary. It would be removed once a ceremony or a songline or whatever was concluded. So what we now understand Indigenous traditional art to be is still a result of colonialism. Like, it's now something to be bought, to be consumed, to be owned, and that was never something that was part of that traditional culture. Does the same thing happen in Pacific art as well? Is it still being affected and changed and commodified and yeah?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the word art in English doesn't, it's not mutually transferable to anything in the Pacific, because, as I mentioned, our creative practices, like as you've said, are inextricable from being. So the idea of a gallery, the idea that it can be looked at or engaged with as something disconnected from ourselves, is so foreign. In the Pacific, I mean, I worked with this wonderful tattooist a couple of years ago who said, Pacific art, those words is something that has been defined in diaspora. Because what it exists in diaspora is not what it is in the Pacific. Another interesting observation is how much Pacific dance has changed. So how much dance was circular, and that it would be about performing to each other, to your own community. So the idea of turning out to an audience is very much a result of contact with something else. And so, yes, absolutely, Pacific art, and I use the hashtag Pacific art all the time, is absolutely something which has grown out of contact with the outside world. What we talk about as Pacific art in galleries is largely now just anything made by ethnically Pacific people. And for me, my kind of brand is about people who actually are embedded in their communities and want to make commentary about things that affect their communities. So yeah, it's become a completely different thing and it's definitely, there is also no such thing as Pacific culture, because of course we're talking about a third of the world's surface, ocean surface, with incredible diversity linguistically, culturally, and there is no such thing as a homogenous idea of what the Pacific is. So, but absolutely, I agree with that. It's a post-colonial construct.
I think we have time for one more question, but I did also just want to reflect on, obviously some of the examples you shared really highlighted some of the challenges of, as an independent First Nations curator, working with institutions such as, established galleries and museums. And I wondered if you could share some advice that you have for curators and gallery directors that might be in the audience or listening to the recording. What would be your advice about what is the best way? What is some actual tangible, practical things that people could consider and how they can work really meaningfully? Yeah. And you spoke about time already, which I think is a really important consideration. But if there's some other thoughts you'd like to share, that would be really wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm always harping on about social inclusion, and social inclusion doesn't start from programming and exhibition making, it starts from the top. So have we got social inclusion on our boards? What does our management look like? What does our marketing team look like? What does our social media voice look like? So I think for me, sometimes it's difficult in thinking about how do we affect that systemic change. But one project Auckland Art Gallery's done, which has been really great, has been called Visible Voices. And this is a 3-year project looking at the data of Auckland Art Gallery's collections in relation to Pacific artists, their audience numbers and their engagement through education and public programming, and connecting some dots in terms of their low Pacific audience numbers. So what the data has revealed is a gaping gap in terms of what is collected, who is engaged through education, programming, and what exhibitions have looked like since Auckland Art Gallery was established. And so it's the data which has informed strategy, which can inform systemic change. So sometimes it starts with a really strong self-reflection. The Guerrilla Girls have an incredible way of doing this. I encourage everyone to look at your stats. Who is actually represented? And my biggest thing is that I get asked to be on a lot of panel discussions as sort of the token brown girl a lot. And I mean, this is again, Guerrilla Girls have just had a great show in Auckland and met Frida Kahlo and it was amazing. But it's literally a art world thing is that you get asked to be in public programming and workshops, but never in shows. And so I think if organisations are going to do some self-reflection, it's to really look at everything across the board. Why are you getting people on panel discussions? What boxes are actually being ticked? And then in terms of approaching communities, it's actually about what power does an institution hold, and what power needs to be shifted to make that a balance, and not make it a one-sided sort of gain, really.
Or conversation.
Yeah.
One final question. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I noticed in one of those pictures you and Julia were in the Cambridge Museum, and there were a number of, I assume, tattooing implements in front of you. And I just, there's a lot of talk about repatriation of objects, and I wondered what your thinking is about that and the relationship between those big institutions in Europe and our end of the world.
Yeah, thank you. It's Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology has the largest collection of Fijian objects outside of Fiji, thanks to Baron von Hugel. He was actually obsessed with tattooing and returned to England with tattoos, even though they were meant for women. So Baron von Hugel's collection formed that collection. So they've actually got the largest collection of Vea Gear tools in the world. And people have thought that potentially, as Christianization was happening in Fiji, these tools were just discarded because they weren't needed anymore. So he, went and collected them all up, which is cool. So I've been involved a little bit in discussions around decolonising the museum. Our experience when we went to Cambridge was quite sad. So we felt, a lot of Indigenous people talk about objects in museums as living ancestral energy. So it was sad to see them basically in lifetime detention. And we left feeling sad. Yeah. So those experiences, I think museums need to, I think they are understood and talked about at a very surface level. Like Auckland Museum has this wonderful project called Pacific Collection Access Project, bringing Pacific communities in to see these objects and for their narratives to be recorded, because a lot of the Pacific objects in museums around the world, the only provenance that's noted is the person who gifted it. So there's very little information about actually the object in relation to the Indigenous communities they come from. So what Auckland Museum is doing is trying to sort of build that information around the objects. But I was in Berlin last year, and there's a strong sentiment that repatriation is a necessary process. That yes, it would mean that a lot of museums in Europe would be empty, but what I think decolonisation is about reconciliation and investing back in the communities that so many of those collections have been taken from. And not always stolen. In the case of Fiji, we were very accommodating to our colonisers. We asked to be in the British Empire. So, and as I mentioned with our Javanese project, Fijians exchange gifting all the time. So a lot of the objects, Fijian collection objects around the world, are actually being given quite genuine grounds. But I think, repatriation is an important part of sort of recognising that actually a lot of collections for museums are used as economic collateral in terms of loans and developments for museums. So all the economic value of those objects in those museums needs to be reinvested, particularly in the Pacific, where we're a region of developing countries. In Fiji, we can't even find enough money to start our own national art gallery. So, repatriation is cultural, it's economic, it's necessary. It's a difficult conversation to have. I found it a lot easier to talk about it in Germany, than in the UK. In Germany, the same word for guilt is the same word for debt. And so there's an understanding, particularly with their history, that guilt comes as a transaction of something. Something needs to be repaid. In the UK, it's just like you make everyone awkward, they leave the room. So yeah, it's an interesting interface. Thank you.
I think we should wrap up this morning's conversation, and I'd like to express our absolute thanks and gratitude to you, Emma. Thank you for coming all the way over from South Auckland and for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. Please join me in thanking Emma for her time.